Well, all right, all right, all right. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. We are talking about the prelude to the Civil War. We are talking about bleeding Kansas and getting up through the election of one Abraham Lincoln today in this here lecture. All right, I'll stop now. I'm sorry, guys. All right, so bleeding Kansas. Um, this is following the very controversial Kansas, there it is. No, no, there we go. This is following the very controversial Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, pushed through Congress by that young upstart Democratic senator from Illinois, Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas, a fierce rival of Abraham Lincoln, a young congressman after the Mexican-American War. Stephen Douglas wanted to authorize the idea of popular sovereignty in Western territories as the deciding factor in if those territories, when incorporated into statehood, would become free states or slave states. That is the essential essence behind the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, what it did, though, was reversed over 30 plus years, 32, 33, y'all know I'm bad at math, about 33 years of precedents as set forth by the Missouri Compromise. Because remember, the big Mo here, that's the state of Missouri. The Missouri Compromise said that no states incorporated above the 36th parallel, this red line right here on the map, shall become entered into the Union as slaveholding states. Well, if popular sovereignty would allow the people of the Kansas Territory or the Nebraska Territory to decide for themselves to make those territories, when they became states, into slave-owning states, that would essentially render the Missouri Compromise null and void. It would be obsolete. It would be finis. It would be done. Okay. And this is really what galvanizes, what creates the Republican Party. And remember, for Republicans, it's not that I was reading some of y'all's discussion questions about this, so I know this is something I need to reiterate. It's not that every Northerner was an abolitionist. It's not even that most Northerners were abolitionists. No, no, no. Okay. Very few people were abolitionists. Abolitionists were ridiculed and mocked and hated. Their newspapers and magazines burned. I forgot what you call like a newspaper shop, whatever it's called. They were burned. Like abolitionists were lynched, even in the North. Like it was terrible, terrible violence against abolitionists, even in the North, where slavery was mostly gone and phased out through gradual emancipation by the 1830s. I mean, they did have slaves before that in most northern states up through the early 1800s. And in these border states like Missouri, Kentucky, Virginia, Delaware, Maryland, which is where the capital, Washington, D.C. is, those all definitely had slaves, slave owning places. So there was slavery and vestiges of slavery and definite institutional racism in the North, and abolitionists were very rare. But this Republican Party is truly going to be a sectional party only existing in the North. It was only in the North that you had the Republicans. And it came from some of the Democrats in the North. It came from a lot of the Whigs that were in the North. It came from all of the Free Soilers that were mostly in the North. And it came from many of the Know Nothings or the American Party people that were mostly in the North. It was a party of the North. And its main purpose was to halt the spread of slavery into the West. Well, if they're not truly, I mean, some of the Republicans, some abolition, like if you were an abolitionist, you probably did join the Republican Party. That was the party for you versus the other parties. But it wasn't that the Republican Party's platform, because people back in this day actually still read party platforms, if you can believe it. They were actually interested in political parties' views and what their stances were on issues, and they read those things. Amazing, right? How far we've come. Yeah, the platform of the Republican Party didn't call for widespread abolition. Their party stance was a lot tougher in like the 1856 election when they fielded their first Republican nominee, John C. Fremont, for the presidency. But overall, their stance on halting the expansion of slavery out to the West was more in the interest of your common white man. Okay. And the idea that, like the old Jeffersonian view, that poor white people need land in order to be self-sufficient, in order to have farms and businesses and operate on their own independently, they need to have land. Land is the key to freedom. Okay. And if the slaveholders get a hold of that land out west, like Kansas, Nebraska, or the Southern Territory we got from the Mexican-American War, then that land will become the slave-holding King Cotton oligarchy like we see in the South, where you have the few rich plantation owners controlling much of the land and its resources, and you have the poor whites, the majority of the people, living as impoverished second-class citizens, and of course the slaves being truly like third-class citizens. And so there was no place for the common man with that sort of framework like the South had in place, with their large, scale planter population controlling most of the land. And so for average normal white people to have a shot at freedom and controlling land, they needed to preserve the Western territories as free from the institution of slavery. And that was the dominant interest of the Republican Party from all these different groups that join it. Okay, so now it's in that vein that we get to Bleeding Kansas in about from about the Kansas-Nebraska Act when it was passed in 1854 up to almost the Civil War. Basically, I think Kansas joins the Union in January of 1861 after Southern states had already begun to secede. This is going to be the prelude to the Civil War fought in Kansas, where hundreds of people die. Horace Greeley, the New York Tribune editor, famous newspaper writer of the day, Horace Greeley said he was the one who coined the term. I don't know what I'm saying. Bleeding Kansas, to talk about this death and violence that was happening out in the Kansas territory as people fought, literally violently killing one another over what Kansas would enter the Union as when it's applied for statehood, free state or slave state. Hundreds of border ruffians, as they were called, people from the slaveholding state of Missouri, crossed the border into Kansas. So, hold up. So hundreds of Missourians crossed the border into Kansas over here, and they're going to set up a pro-slavery capital in Lecompton, Kansas, where they draft a pro-slavery constitution, state constitution, that they submit to the United States Congress for approval to become a slave-holding state under the idea of popular sovereignty. Now, President Pierce, oh, by the way, we have a new president at this time, moving right along, right? So remember, Zachary Taylor dies of like intestinal problems like a year into office. So his vice president, Millard Fillmore, is going to fill in as like another Whig. Okay, so we got like 3 Whig presidents in total. And then Millard Fillmore is not going to win re-election, or I guess his first election. Instead, the Democrats are going to choose, which the Democratic Party is like the only national party. I mean, it's the only party that's in the North and the South at this time. They're going to choose for themselves this guy from Vermont, Franklin Pierce, who was very young for the time for president, good looking, and definitely an expansionist. But he's a Northern Democrat, but he's definitely in, what's the word, apathetic towards the issue of slavery. He's not really taking a strong stance either way. And so Pierce is going to be the one to sign off on this pro-slavery constitution in Kansas, this Lecompton Constitution. Now, meanwhile, you had states in the North, especially New England, such as Massachusetts, that were recruiting hundreds of free state people, free staters, to literally move to Kansas, settle the area, and make it a free state. And among those people that are going to go to Kansas to make it a free state was John Brown and his sons. John Brown, he was the son of a pastor. He'd failed at many different businesses. He is a devout Christian. He believes that he was destined for God to do something great with his life. And that cause would be abolition, to free the slaves by whatever means necessary. He is a hardcore believer. And he had like about 20 sons over the space of his life. John Brown and many of these free staters, they're going to Kansas as well, and they set up a free state capital in Lawrence, Kansas. So you have 2 different state capitals, and you have these free staters and these border ruffians, these pro-slavery people, fighting one another in Kansas from 1854 to 1859. This is called Bleeding Kansas. One of the most tragic incidents that you should be aware of was the Potawatomi Creek Massacre, where John Brown and like 3 or 4 of his sons are going to go to a house near the Potawatomi Creek in Kansas, and they're going to abduct from the house 5 pro-slavery men right in front of their wives and children. And they're going to drag them to the creek, the aforementioned creek, because I don't want to say that long name again. And they're going to hack them to bits with broadswords, literally hack grown men to death in front of their loved ones and family. It was brutal, as brutal and unimaginably grotesque as you could get. And this was done in the name of defending Kansas against the incursion of slavery. This is not the last we'll see of John Brown, and he raises some interesting, morally ambiguous questions about terrorism and when the means justify the ends. But that is Bleeding Kansas, and for many, it convinced the nation that the question of would slavery endure could only be answered with bloodshed. In the election of 1856, you have the Republican John C. Fremont. Remember, he was the young, dashing captain who's going to go into California during the Mexican-American War and briefly, for 1 month, set up the Bear Republic, California as a nation, before the American ships arrived in San Fran and Los Angeles harbors, rolled up that American flag. So he is deeply involved in Californian politics. John C. Fremont was also the first free state senator. Remember, in California, they had 1 free state senator and 1 pro-slavery senator. That was set up in the Compromise of 1850 that admitted California as a free state. But John C. Fremont, senator from California, he was very young. He was very handsome. He was very well married and well connected. And he is the first Republican to run for higher office, for the presidency. That was not Abraham Lincoln, but rather John C. Fremont, the first Republican to run for president. And he does pretty darn well. Because again, the Republican Party, look at the map, they are a party only in the North, but the North has way more people than the South does at this time. If you don't count the slave population, which, remember, the Constitution doesn't, 3/5 compromise, then the Southern white population only accounted for about 1/3 of the population of the country. So the North population is huge at this time, which will be its primary advantage in the Civil War. And so John C. Fremont, let's look here at the vote totals of the popular vote. He's in the dark blue. He gets over 1 million votes, okay? You have the know-nothings represented by the Whig president, Millard Fillmore, former president, running. They get 874,000 votes. And then the Democratic Party, the last national party at this time, that's both kind of in the North and definitely heavily in the South, they scrape by with the win. But this does show that the Republican Party is becoming a major force in politics, because again, they united all those various groups. They're uniting those free soilers. They're uniting the know-nothing. Some of them voted for Fremont. They're uniting definitely the Northern Whigs and the Northern Democrats, who were disgusted with the slave-dominated Democratic Party of the South. And this is where you gotta understand there was a conspiracy going around that had some merit to it, that many were alluding to, is called the slave power conspiracy. That basically said that in America's highest government positions, in the Supreme Court, especially after the Dred Scott case, in the presidency, in the executive branch, in Congress, especially in the Senate, because of the 3/5 compromise, that there was a slave power conspiracy that was basically trying to spread slavery across the frontier. Now, the person who's going to win the election, James Buchanan, he was the Democrat, and again, just like Pierce. And by the way, this isn't anything you ever need to know for a test, and I'm sorry, those of you who are like, please get off at miss. This is already going to be way too long for me. But real quick, Franklin Pierce was a sad sack of a president. Usually goes down as one of the worst we've ever had and one of the most forgettable we've ever had, which is a pretty impressive distinction of being both of those things at once. But Pierce was wanting to expand. He was the one that actually, I think I misspoke a few lectures ago, but he was the one that actually authorized and signed the trade agreement with Japan that opened Japan for trade under Matthew Perry's expedition. And it was Pierce that also is the one who really, really tried to make inroads to annexing Cuba as a territory of the United States at this time. But Pierce entered the presidency only a few weeks after, well, actually, they got sworn in at March. It was January 6th that this happened, but it was a month or two after the election. So he was the incoming president. He was about to be sworn in, and he was on a train ride with his wife and one of his sons, and he'd already lost both of his older sons. So he and his wife, who she always kind of suffered from depression anyway, having lost two of her sons, they're on this train with their last remaining son, their little boy Benji, and actually I think they called him Benny. And the train derails and it goes down a ravine. The car decouples and it falls down this ravine, and it crushes against rocks and everything else, and the metal shears. And Pierce and his wife somehow survive. This is the president-elect of the United States, Franklin Pierce. And this was in January 6, 1853. And when they finally find his son, who had been, sitting right next to him just moments before this train derailed, his son was basically decapitated. And Pierce couldn't get his wife away quick enough, so she ended up seeing it as well. And that was the state that the Pierces enter the White House in. So that might have also affected his poor showing for presidency. But both Pierce and before him Fillmore, and before him Zachary Taylor, and now James Buchanan, this Democrat that gets elected. He was only elected, James Buchanan, the old public functionary he was called, because he'd been out of the country for the last few years. He'd been a diplomat, over an ambassador to England or whatnot. And so he'd been away from the slave state, free state divide, hadn't had to take a stance on that, like Stephen Douglas with his popular sovereignty. And so he wasn't framed as one way or the other. So that was really how he got elected, because he hadn't been in America dealing with all this stuff. The only other thing I'll say about James Buchanan is that, well, not only is he going to not prevent the Civil War from happening, so bad on him for not doing anything to prevent that, but B, James Buchanan was most likely the first and only homosexual president that we've ever had. There's a lot of historical documents and letters and evidence to suggest it's probably the case. He never married. He liked the guys. It was probably the case. Now they didn't have such a thing as like coming out of the closet back in the day. So it's never been confirmed, but there you go, James Buchanan. And that brings us to the Dred Scott decision in 1857, one of the most, if not the most, notorious and infamous decisions in the Supreme Court's history. Roger B. Taney was this Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, chosen by Andrew Jackson, because remember, Supreme Court justices serve for life, so he'd been on the court for a while now. And this case comes to his court in 1857. It was a case of a slave who'd been waiting to have this case heard for many, many years. He was an old man by this point, but Dred Scott, the slave from Missouri, had basically gone with his master, who was an Army doctor, up to northern states, including like northern territories like Minnesota. And while in these northern states, Dred Scott helped him out with tending for wounded people and helping out his doctor master. And he lived in the north in these free states for many years, and actually met friends and met his wife, a free woman, up in the north. And then he was sold to a new master and had to go back down to Missouri. And this is where Dred Scott, with the help of an abolitionist society, is going to sue. And he actually wins his local court case, saying that because he had been in a state living for many years where slavery was not allowed, that he's not a slave. He'd been in a free state. He should have been a free man. And so he won that local case, and then when it was appealed by the prosecution up to the state of Missouri backtracked and said, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, no, 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 no," because that obviously would have corroded the whole system of slavery right there. That was a really big issue. So the state of Missouri and their findings of this state court said, "No, no, no, he's still a slave." And so they appealed this once again. The defense appeals this up to the Supreme Court, and Chief Justice Roger B. Taney and his Supreme Court, they say not only does Dred Scott not have the right to sue the government because he is a slave, but Dred Scott has no rights because he is property and not a citizen. Blacks had no rights to which the white man was bound to respect, was the famous quote from Taney here. So basically saying that slaves were not people, they were property, and hoping to basically the court was being kind of pushed to make a big decision on the issue of free versus slave to finally help put this monster to bed. But what they did was they basically confirmed to many Northerners the suspicion that there was a vast slaveholding, slave power conspiracy taking effect in our national government, including in the sacred trust of the Supreme Court of the United States that was supporting and upholding slave power, the right of people to own other people. So that was the Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott, by the way, he only lived a little bit after the case. Again, he was an old man by that point. I think his life ended mostly okay with his family and everything. And actually, his last owner was one of the people who helped him to fight this decision and get to court and stuff. But this decision will have immense ramifications on the prelude to the Civil War. And I realize that this is probably a little shorter than I meant to go, but it's getting dark and I got to feed horses. They're going to be very upset. So we're going to end there. You're welcome. And we will talk about Abraham Lincoln in the next lecture. Thank you guys. Bye.